Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Good evening, everyone. I am so excited to be able to be here and thankful. I'm grateful for Dan and Henry and Aaron and everyone who's helping. And I'm really excited to be able to contribute something that I can't wait to share with you. It's kind of a burden of conscience that has me here because I've understood something that I think is really cool, even though I probably shouldn't be here. I've got so many things to do, but of course I'm also honored to be here. I'm the best vehicle as far as I can tell for this idea at the moment, and I'm excited to share it with you. Now, one of the things that I want to invite you to pay attention to today is, in these few moments that I have with you, is for those of you who are familiar with Rudolf Steiner's biography, one of the characteristic features is that we see a person who kind of in the first, let's say, 40 years of his life really lives into the contemporary public intellectual culture of his time, and then increasingly actually takes on the role of a spiritual teacher. And in a way, maybe it seems less involved in what we would call normal public secular concerns. Let's just put it that way. Scientific, public, intellectual becomes spiritual teacher. But I would like to offer you something which I think is an accurate counter movement, that there's another stream in his life where he started out with a natural connection with the spirit. And only at the very end of his life did he have a ripened capacity of terrestrial, earthly judgment. And it emerged at the end of his life in 1922 at a course that was given for economics students in Switzerland. And the course has already been mentioned in the last panel with many of the great presentations. But he comes to a contribution to political theory, and particularly to the method of building judgments in economics, which could never be called derivative. And if we know one thing about writing, particularly critical writing about Rudolf Steiner, receptance of Rudolf Steiner, he's often described as someone who's a very derivative thinker, that he took a lot of things and joined them together. Critics see as a kind of charlatan generalist. Now, I'm not suggesting people agree with that. This is a common assessment that you run into in academia related to Rudolf Steiner. But this point that I'm about to share with you, they can't claim that here. I think this is one of his most clearly unique contributions to what I would like to say is the European political theory of judgment. Now I have to back that up. And there's two parts of this. One is I want to, just from a social scientific perspective, I would like to invite you to consider what I'm going to share with you now as a possible explanation for an action research project that already took place. And the action research project was documented in Dan McKanan's study that was published, Eco-Alchemy, the influence anthroposophy in the past, environmental, God, what is the subtitle of Eco? The past and future of environmentalism. Anthroposophy, the past and future of environmentalism. Golly, that's really embarrassing. Sorry. I love this book, but this is a book, and Dan, who of course is our host here, opened a whole terrain, and the next presenter on this panel actually just published. It appeared just 2 months ago, a compendium with Springer Nature of contributions that were inspired by Dan's study. And the conclusion of Dan's study is that students of anthroposophy played a really important role in the emergence of the modern environmental movement as we know it. Now, okay, that's really cool. Some of you may have already known that before, But there's something interesting about this that from a social scientific perspective, there's two levels that I want to look at. And one is I want to offer tonight a partial explanation of how it is that students of anthroposophy could play this role. And this is not exactly what Dan presents in his book. Dan presents 4 gifts of anthroposophy. Because of time, I'm not going to go into it. Maybe Johannes will in the next contribution. But still, I just want to offer partial explanation. The second part of what I want to keep in mind is the idea of self-understanding. How do students of anthroposophy self-define and understand themselves and their actions in such a way that it could lead to their being able to play a significant role in the emergence of the modern environmental movement. Now, one of the quotes from Dan, this is kind of conclusion after an amazing study that was published. If you haven't seen this book, I highly recommend it. He says, without the, quote, yeasty contributions of anthroposophical initiatives, there might have been no organic agriculture, okay, no campaign to ban DDT, no community-supported agriculture, and no environmental banks, end quote. Those are pretty significant. Wow, that's super cool. Two points now. One is explanation. How can we explain the fact that students of anthroposophy were able to play this role? Two, what was the self-understanding that was connected with them playing that role? And I want to suggest tonight that it consists in a certain culture of what we're going to call judgment. Judgment. Typically, a common parlance, don't be judgmental. We're going to talk about being judgmental tonight. And judgmental in regards to the boundaries of the planet and economic value chains. That's the kind of judgment I'm interested in, and what Steiner was interested in. But these are not spiritual, clairvoyant judgments. These are actually based on sense perceptions and imaginative value judgments infused with feelings of how much is this loaf of bread worth, basically. And he comes to this in 1922, right? The height, in a certain way, of his role as a spiritual teacher. He comes to this most earthly contribution to economic political theory. What is it? And this is amazing, because already we've heard some presentation, well-known factor that we've heard about Rudolf Steiner. In his early intellectual life, he becomes the editor of the natural scientific writings of Goethe. And one of the things he has to come to terms with has been mentioned here, which is Goethe's method of intuitive understanding. Now, note on language, intuitive. Now, in philosophy of freedom, intuition, which has been quoted in the last panel, is referred to as pure thinking in most cases. In Kantian philosophy, it has to do with sense perception. So with what we're talking about when we talk about Goethe, as was mentioned in the presentation earlier from John McCallis, Kant and his critique of judgment, which was his last critique, beautiful book. He writes about the possibility, the hypothesis that you could have something called intuitive understanding. Instead of it saying intuitive, why don't we say sensorial understanding? So basically, a way of understanding reality through our senses and imagination. But Kant comes to the conclusion that no, this is not really possible for human beings. And as John mentioned, Mr. McCallis in the last presentation, Goethe said, why not? And in fact, Goethe had just been on a journey in Italy where he famously came to a kind of wonderful contribution to botany, which became a foundation of morphology, the science of morphology. Now, Goethe went on to read Kant. Now, Goethe is not a philosopher. He is a genius of perception. I mean, just to read Goethe's scientific writings in German it's like drinking a tall glass of water. I mean, is really beautiful. And in translation, it's actually quite difficult sometimes to understand what Goethe is saying because he was so connected with the German language, my opinion. But if you can read it in German, you really get this impression. So refreshing, so beautiful. So Goethe reads Kant and he says, now I think I understand myself better. I think I can develop what Kant's talking about. So what did Kant talk about? Kant talked about if you could have something called sensorial understanding, brackets, intuitive understanding, Kantian philosophy, then you would start by having an observation like the fact that the sky is blue or the sunset is red or orange, and you would actually try to change the conditions so that you could have another observation. And you would change the conditions so that you would have an exhaustive series of observations of color phenomena. And in the end, you would understand color. Right? So he was like, let's try that. That's when he wrote his color theory. It was this magnificent scientific effort in the history of science, right? So the color theory, and this has been detailed in a beautiful book by Eckhart Förster, 25 Years of Philosophy, where he describes a little bit how Goethe came to this method. You have all these observations and they come to a pinnacle in what was the primal phenomenon, which is not an idea, but it's actually like in the color theory, for instance, it's a perception of the relationship between light, darkness, and turbidity, or in botany, it's the perception of the spiritual primal plant or archetypal plant, depending on translation that you might prefer. Everybody with this is really rigorous empiricism, actually, like super rigorous empiricism observation. Basic method, observe many moments, different conditions, culmination, primal phenomena. Now, Dan McKanan describes this as well in his book, Eco-Alchemy. That's one of the core practices of the anthroposophical community, students of anthroposophy. Now, okay, Steiner edits this work, right? Okay, we got that far. 1919 launches the movement for social threefolding. One aspect of this movement, which we've just heard something about it, is economics and fraternity. This culminates in his economics course in 1922, when he goes into this most beautiful detail about his idea of associative economics. Now, even if Rudolf Steiner did not explicitly say, my associative economics is a transformation of Goethe's sensorial understanding, you could figure it out. Why could you figure it out? Okay, so associative economics, in a nutshell, you start out with a cooperative framing. So framing, intentionality, we want to work together to meet one another's needs. No competition, capitalism. We start with this framing of cooperation. But that's not enough. What Steiner suggested then is that you have to come to collective value judgments. So the distributors, the consumers, and the producers, they all have to get together and they talk about what something is worth and what it takes to make it happen from their perspective in a modern value chain in the economy. Everybody. So what's it going to mean for you to help us make this loaf of bread? So I've already mentioned a loaf of bread. This is the driver. So the driver, what's it going to take for you to deliver this from the bakery to the store every morning at 4:30 a.m.? Calculation, mechanics costs, insurance, etc. You'll follow. This is very daily bread stuff. Okay. Try to get a joke in there. What is the result? True price. Can you see this? Everyone shares observations of a value chain in the modern economy. Their ability to discern the value, what it takes to make something together with a cooperative intention. What does it culminate in? True price. True price is the price that needs to be paid at any moment in a value chain so that the person involved has enough to take care of themselves and their dependents long enough to repeat the action. Right? There's not a primal phenomenon here. No. Goethe, he had all these observations that culminates in the primal phenomenon. Beautiful. This culminates in true price. And when I was sitting around at my fireplace, it was a year ago today, I realized this. I said, Steiner's associative economics is a metamorphosis of intuitive understanding. And then I was like, he must have talked about this. Anybody know if he talked about this? I knew it. He did. 5 minutes? 4. Okay, thank you. We're almost there. He talks about it very briefly 2 times, and it's in the discussion sessions with the economics students after the lectures. He explicitly connects his contribution to economic science as a transformation of Goethe's intuitive understanding. Now show me where he got that one. That's really amazing. That was a really unique contribution. Now what's really cool, that's self-understanding. So for instance, students of Anthroposophy have been working out of that understanding and founding GLS Bank and the community-supported agricultural movement and all the things that Dan McKanan lists. And what is it, what is the significance of this? Well, there's 2 things that I'm going to close with now. One is just saying both Goethean science and Rudolf Steiner's economics belong to what we call in the European tradition of political theory as aesthetic education. It's education of judgment and feeling. With Goethe, he explicitly says that intuitive understanding inspires a fear for the phenomenal world and a feeling of resignation before the majesty of the limits of existence in general for human beings. Now, these are good things for the Anthropocene to have those qualities. We don't generally recognize the boundaries of the planet, for example. But with associative economics, there's a training in feeling and in judgment, aesthetic education, not just art, which is connected with being able to perceive the needs of other people and the limits of bioregions related to economic production and consumption. Follow that? So Rudolf Steiner matured in his terrestrial judgment at the end of his life after a long journey. And not only that, set something in motion, which then became an action research project that was documented by Dan McKanan. And his hypothesis was confirmed. That this is a very effective way to look at economics and cooperation. It has a huge amount of potential for the future. And I'd like to dedicate this feeling of hope to all the young people I work with. And just the last word I want to say, if you will indulge me, the opening evening of this conference, there was a reception actually. And one of the things that was shared by Henry Holland and Aaron French was how a lot of biographies and presentations of Rudolf Steiner actually reflect the people who talk about him more than him. And in this particular instance, that is absolutely true. And I want to particularly mention Peter Staudenmaier, who's a social ecologist who has dedicated a lot of work actually to studying Rudolf Steiner and Anthroposophy. You may know his work if you have looked around a little bit. And Peter Staudenmaier, if you go through and look at where he talks about Rudolf Steiner's economic thought and think about what I told you today. And what you're going to find is you're going to find Peter Staudenmaier is talking about a bunch of tropes in a similar way that Henry Holland and Aaron French referred to some of Steiner's greatest critics 100 years ago talking about him. The influences on Steiner's economic theory are attributed to a self-understanding related to nationalism, kind of woolly thought about capitalism, private property, and really not a clearly defined economic idea. Well, all of these things are wrong. I can't say, there's some things that Peter is right about, Peter Staudenmaier. There's certain things that the anthroposophical movement and students at Anthroposophy need to live up to that he's pointed out, but that does not attest to the quality of a lot of the research that he presents. And with that, I would like to close. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, Preston Fellows of Harvard College.